Hello, and welcome to another lecture in American Politics, Political Science 1, Introduction to the Study of Government and Politics in the United States at Berkeley City College. Today's lecture series is part one of a series on interest groups and the pressure system and the impact of that system on our democracy. I want to begin by recognizing that for the most part, in our society, we have a kind of cultural perspective that views interest groups or lobbying in a negative light. And to recognize that oftentimes that perspective is a product of a historical process of interest group behavior and activity within our environment that has really created a kind of national and historical perspective on interest groups and their capacity to influence our politics in a very specific way. I also want to recognize that the discussion relative to interest groups and lobbying is something that is oftentimes defined by an inaccurate or a misconstrued sense of what an interest group is. Oftentimes, people have different ideas and different definitions of what interest groups are, how they're formed, who they represent, and how exactly interest groups are able to successfully influence and pressure our institutions of government and the representatives within those institutions. The lecture series on interest groups and the study of the pressure system and its influence in our democracy in this class is designed to help provide a common language and framework to analyze not only the historical and contemporary arguments that frame interest groups being either good or bad for democracy, but also give us the greater capacity to understand how interest groups are formed and under what conditions do they flourish, and potentially what could be changed within our organizing and national environment to limit the capacity of interest groups and their influence on our institutions of government. It's also important when talking about interest groups, and we will certainly do this in this lecture series, to talk about the reality of interest groups and the barriers to effective pressure that exist within interest groups' competitive equality. Clearly, in our contemporary world, not all interest groups are equal. Not all lobbyists are able to effectively and efficiently pressure the institutions of government and the representatives within those institutions in exactly the same way with the same degree of results. And so we'll look at some of those barriers and finally analyze the different ways in which throughout the 20th and now 21st century we have seen efforts to mitigate the negative impacts of interest groups and create a more equal and fair environment, potentially fair and more equal environment where interest groups can pressure and influence elected officials in a way that is much more productive and more equally representative to preserve that second principle of representation, political equality. Let's begin by defining specifically what an interest group is and the different terms that have been used to identify this incredibly important institution, really, within our linkage level. Interest groups are defined as any organization or association that seeks to influence public policy as a way to protect or advance some interest. To do this, interest groups try to influence the behavior of public officials, such as presidents, members of our legislative branch, bureaucrats who work within the different agencies of government, and even judges to an extent. The efforts to exert to try to influence behavior are often perceived by the elected officials and by other organizations as attempting to pressure them into a certain kind of behavior. And so this is why interest groups are also times often referred to as pressure groups. The term lobbyist or to lobby is also commonly used in our society today to talk about interest groups because of the practice of interest group representatives talking to representatives and senators in the lobbies outside of committee rooms. This is a reference to the actual context in which interest group representatives are physically meeting with members in the House of Representatives and members from the Senate specifically in the lobby areas outside of the committee rooms or in the lobby areas outside of their offices. And so it is with this in mind that the term lobbyist was first introduced in the 1830s when Andrew Jackson was president, where there was the beginning of a dramatic increase in the number of lobbyists hanging out in the lobbies of the Capitol building and the offices around it. And so today we oftentimes refer to the labor lobby or the gun lobby or the senior citizen lobby. And that term lobbyists or pressure groups are connected to not only the function of what interest groups do in terms of trying to influence behavior, but also the history and the contemporary context in which most interest groups and representatives of interest groups meet with representatives in the lobbies outside of their offices and outside of the congressional chambers to try to influence and pressure them into a certain kind of behavior which is consistent or more consistent with their interests. The first term, factions, has perhaps a more historical significance and value because it is grounded in one of the most important works published in those very famous 85 Federalist Papers. Factions, although a term that we don't normally use today to describe interest groups, was the term first utilized by James Madison to talk about interest groups coming out of the Constitutional Convention, recognizing that one of the key critiques of the Constitution that was articulated by the anti-federalists in those very famous publications that argued in favor of not ratifying the Constitution was directed specifically at the capacity for centralized government to be more concentrated in a specific place, giving narrow segments of the population a greater capacity to inaccurately represent the will of the people. And so James Madison in Federalist 10 introduced this concept of factions and the influence of factions in a negative way in our political environment. And also really he also introduces in Federalist 10 a key and important definition of factions, which is important to consider moving forward, because this definition of factions and this being the first context in Federalist 10 in which the discussion about the negative influencing of interest groups began, really created the foundation for our contemporary views in our world today that interest groups are not necessarily the best thing for political equality. And so I wanted to spend a little bit more time talking specifically about what is traditionally called the evils of factions theory, or to use James Madison's own terms, the mischiefs of factions. It is within Federalist 10 that James Madison introduces this term, factions, as being necessarily a concern of any democracy, and specifically an important concern for a representative or indirect democracy, where by design representatives are there to represent the will of interests within our population. The concern within Federalist 10 is that factions are what Madison defines as narrow groups of the population that try to advance their own interest at the expense of the public, is really the greatest degree of concern for James Madison. This second aspect of narrow groups of the population trying to influence interests, the second aspect being that interest comes at the expense of the public, is a crucial and important aspect of understanding James Madison's essential thesis, which is that because these narrow groups of the population in advancing their own interests are doing so at the expense of the plurality or at the expense of the greater majority of the public, are creating an environment which is inherently exclusionary, and if successful in influencing the behavior of the representatives within an indirect democracy, the policies and laws that those institutions would produce would not represent the people as democracy would require, but rather a narrow population within that greater population, and would do so at the expense or at the cost of affecting more negatively the greater majority. It is because of this analysis that within Federalist 10, the basic theme or inherent kind of thesis of Federalist 10 is that interest groups, again, because of the characteristic of interest groups and its capacity to advance and successfully influence policies at the expense of the public, that interest groups are bad for democracy. This theme, although necessarily prominent within Federalist 10, is a theme that is consistent throughout the history of American politics. The evils of factions theme reoccurs throughout our history consistently, in first manifesting itself in the election of our first populist president, a president who runs on the platform of this evils of factions theory, that interest groups are going to, these narrow segments of the population are going to try to influence, perhaps through money, perhaps through connections and proximity, our representatives in a way that will hurt the people. That kind of populist message was first packaged and successfully ran upon when Andrew Jackson was elected to be the 7th president of the United States. For Jackson to successfully win and become president, he had to do so in a way that created a kind of conflict between the institutions and the operators and representatives within that institution and the people. And the point of that conflict that Jackson so successfully pivoted on was the tip of interest groups' capacity to be bad for the people, to advance their narrow populated interests at the expense of the people in the plurality. Andrew Jackson's successful presidential campaign and then re-election to a second term was the first political campaign to really exploit and utilize this classical interest groups are bad for you argument, but it certainly was not the last in our contemporary world. We had in the 20th century, you have Teddy Roosevelt really successfully packaging a progressive message that if elected, he would square the deal, so to speak, and break up all of the monopolies and trusts within Washington and the country that were, because of their capacity, size, and money, able to influence our government. And if you don't have money, if you don't have capacity, if you aren't a part of any kind of massive monopoly, Theodore Roosevelt argues, you were not at the table. And so his presidency, another two-term, very popular presidency, was defined by what policy historians refer to as Theodore Roosevelt's square deal policies. And again, playing off of the success of Theodore Roosevelt, you have Franklin Roosevelt coming along in the time of the Great Depression, and of course during the earliest years of World War II, really creating the New Deal policies and the programs that create an attempt to really combat institutional compliance to narrow interests that are oftentimes at the expense of the public. And in particular, during Franklin Roosevelt's time, the policies that had been advanced throughout the 20s prior to Roosevelt's presidency had been advanced by narrow groups of the population in the form of big business that were able to create massive profits and ultimately not distribute those profits throughout the working population. And Roosevelt's policies under the New Deal not only created regulations within the banking industry and the business industries, but affirmed through policy a capacity for the people to have a greater degree of representation within that free market environment. And of course, in our contemporary world, in the 21st century, we've had a slew of candidates at the state and national level running for office on this evils of factions, very populist platform. That there are narrow special interests in Sacramento uh, misrepresenting the people of California. This was a successful platform position of Arnold Schwarzenegger in 2003, when his message ultimately resulted in the very first recall of a California governor in the history of our state. At the time, it was a Democratic governor, Gray Davis, who Arnold Schwarzenegger and the Republican supporters of his campaign were able to successfully point to Governor Gray Davis in 2003 as a representative who was essentially in allowing narrow groups of the population to advance through his governorship policies that came at the expense of the people of California. And Schwarzenegger's advocacy and campaign was connected to, first and foremost, we need to get Gray Davis out of Sacramento and elect someone else. Obviously, in his case, it was himself in the form of Arnold Schwarzenegger, so that he could, in his own words, terminate interest groups in Sacramento. This campaign platform was very successful, and it resulted in a historical first in California in 2003, and ultimately Arnold Schwarzenegger's first election to office in 2003, and then re-election in 2004. 2005, where he continued his governorship. Whether or not Arnold Schwarzenegger was successful in terminating interest groups in Sacramento is, of course, debatable. But what is not debatable is that Schwarzenegger's campaign and his platform was connected to this historical theme that first began with James Madison in Federalist 10, that interest groups or factions or pressure groups or lobbyists are bad for the people. And in most recent times, in 2008, you had two candidates running for president. Of course, the Democratic candidate of Barack Obama, who ultimately won the 2008 presidential election, and even the Republican candidate, John McCain, who had a history of, through policy, changing the rules and creating more regulation to make it harder for interest groups to effectively and efficiently pressure institutions of government and people running for office. It was in 2002 when John McCain, working with Russ Feingold, were able to successfully pass one of the most important reforms and regulations that limit interest groups' capacities to narrowly represent and narrowly influence in the form of the 2002 McCain-Feingold law. And of course, Barack Obama, the Democratic candidate, ran very famously on his platform of change, changing the culture of Washington and making it difficult, if not impossible, for interest groups, his platform suggested, to influence the White House and to change Washington so that it worked again for the people and not for the narrow interests and groups that were no longer a part of or a clue as to the people, but rather to their own narrow interests within their own concerns, which oftentimes Barack Obama argued came at the expense of the public. And so in 2002, or in 2008 rather, the presidential election of 2008, you had two candidates essentially competing to sell the same message that they would change Washington, is the language that Barack Obama used, or McCain used the term reform the way in which Washington works to limit the ability and regulate the capacity of interest groups to misrepresent the will of the people. So in other words, whether we're talking about the presidential election of 2008 or the gubernatorial recall of 2003 or Teddy Roosevelt or Franklin Roosevelt or even Andrew Jackson or all of the different candidates in between who have ran on a platform of interest groups are bad for democracy, that platform was first established in Federalist 10 by James Madison. And it is a theme that has really defined a lot of our politics and the candidacies of individuals running for office at the local, state, and even federal levels. There is, however, a more contemporary competing uh, theory on interest groups and their capacity to influence our politics, and that is a primarily an argument that has been articulated by political scientists who are analyzing, as scientists often do, the pros and cons of something of which they are analyzing. Um, Oftentimes, political scientists, the science of studying politics, which sometimes frustrates people about political scientists, is that we oftentimes aren't trying to advance necessarily our own vision of what is good politics, but as scientists studying and observing politics, we are analyzing the situation and looking at the pros and cons, the good and bad, and trying to, through that analysis, give us a greater degree of probability to make predictions about future activities or future behaviors within a different test or a different environment. And it is within this light, without concern for advancing any particular political agenda or for running for office or for in an effort to try to paint a utopian vision of what is the best political environment possible. It is within this light that political scientists in the late 1990s and into the early part of the 21st century have began to kind of articulate a different kind of perspective on the utility and the function of interest groups within our democracy as it is structured, as the institutional organizations exist, and what exactly an indirect democracy is designed to do. The pluralists are essentially a collection of political scientists who view American politics and the environment of American politics as best understood in terms of the interaction of institutions and the people with those institutions, the conflict or the tension that exists between different groups of people, different associations of people, and the tension or conflict that exists oftentimes within institutions, and the conflict to and the competition to influence the behavior of institutions and the way in which interactions occur. And ultimately, as well, the pluralists argue that politics is essentially an environment in which, or a context in which, bargaining or what is typically referred to as give and take is a part of the process. Essentially, the pluralists are arguing that interest groups are good for democracy, but are arguing it not necessarily through an idealistic or ideological perspective, but rather through the lens of observing how interest groups work and what democracy actually is. Democracy, of course, being supposed to be an institution or a system, rather, not an institution, but a system in which the people are to rule. The question ultimately is, as the pluralists look at how in an indirect democracy we rule, the answer very obviously in an indirect democracy is that the people rule through our institutions of government. We put representatives into those institutions, and we expect them to rule or to represent accurately the will of the people. And after we elect these people into office, the question is that the pluralists pose: how exactly are the people to make sure and to follow up with these elected officials, with our representatives indirectly, to produce policies consistent with the will of the people? And the pluralists essentially argue that interest groups are not just a vehicle, but rather a really good vehicle, a very positive and productive conduit through which people can attempt to influence the policies that their elected officials, perhaps even the ones that they helped put into office, are ultimately producing. The first argument that the pluralists argue is essentially that interest groups are good for democracy because interest groups communicate more adequately the specific wants of people on a continuous basis, especially if you compare that to free elections. While free elections are essential to a democracy, they do not adequately communicate the specific wants and interests of the people to political leaders on a continuous basis. Uh, uh, Interest groups are more accurately, consistently, and frequently conveying to political leaders what the many different groups and organizations within our society actually want in policy. On an election night, the people are communicating who we want to be the drivers of our institutions of government. But the pluralists argue elections are not designed when electing people to office to communicate either adequately or to continuously communicate because they are once a year or maybe in some cases twice a year in a semi-annual basis. And so interest groups are a very effective way for the people to make sure that their institutions of government are ruling in a manner consistent with their interests. The second argument of the pluralists is that interest groups are easy to create. People in the United States today are free to join or to organize groups that reflect their interests. Uh, Most people have some kind of value system, they value certain things. Those values oftentimes translate to what interests they have in the world. Do they have an interest in protecting the environment because they value the ocean or they value clean air? Or do they have do they value getting a greater share of the profit within a business or within the private or public sectors? Do they value having the ability to return items or have goods and services provided to them in a more fair and equitable way in a kind of customer interaction? These are values that oftentimes translate into interests, and if there are collections or groups of individuals who share these interests, they are either free as individuals to begin forming their own interest groups or to join interest groups that are already out there and doing the work and trying to pressure the institutions of government to produce policies consistent with those behaviors. And again, the argument here is that interest groups are easy to create. There isn't a lot of legal restriction on what it takes to create an interest group. The regulation comes after the interest groups are formed and how they actually pressure the institutions of government. So you're free to join or organize groups that reflect your interests, and anybody and everybody is free to join or organize groups. And that is the second argument that the pluralists put down. The third argument of the pluralists is that because of our federal system of government, because of federalism, which is again a system in which there are multiple levels of government, local levels of government, state levels of government, and even national or federal level of government. Because of federalism, and also because of checks and balances, and even the separation of powers within the different levels of government, governmental power in the United States is broadly dispersed. It's local, it's state, it's national, and even within those different levels, it is separated out. There are different institutions in the federal government, the Congress, the presidency, the courts, and even in the Congress, there is a partition, a separating a disbursement of power in the House of Representatives and the Senate. And it's because of this disbursement of power that creates an environment leaving governmental institutions at all levels remarkably porous and open to the interests and efforts to uh, uh, concentrate those concerns at different levels of our government. In other words, because of for example, because we have a federal system of government, we have a city council, and so if you value, you know, driving down the road of Berkeley and not being shaken out of your car because of a poorly paved road, you can form an interest group to pave the roads or streets of Berkeley on an annual basis, so that your value of not having to, you know, be shaken out of your car or have a headache all the time because you're driving on poorly paved roads is formed in an interest group, and then you can, because of a federal system of government, try to pressure your city council, which is a very localized institution of government, which would have a greater capacity to understand and reflect in policy the interests of its community. Without a federal system of government, if the citizens of Berkeley who valued the paving of the streets of Berkeley wanted to get their streets paved without a federal system of government, you'd have to go to Washington, D.C. And so, because of a federal system of government, we have smaller units of government that have power broadly dispersed and are more susceptible and open to the many and diverse groups that exist within our society at the local, state, and even national levels. The fourth argument is really a product of the first three, and that is that because of the ease of interest groups to form and the accessibility of our governmental institutions because of federalism, the fourth argument is that because of these factors, all legitimate interests in our society can have their views taken into account by some public official. And because of this, the system of interest groups within our system of within our political environment is highly democratic. Democracy being connected to the people ruling, and because our society is structured in such a way in which we have a diversity of interests, it is reasonable to believe that our public officials come from those diverse communities and would be more likely necessarily to be susceptible and open to the advocacy of these different communities that exist. So because these communities are able to form interest groups, and because these interest groups have localized governments or state governments or even in some cases national or federal government, which might have a greater degree to impact their interests. We have an environment in which the probability, just the odds of you finding a public official or a selection of public officials that are sharing your interests and have the same values goes up in our system of government and our environment, in large part because of the combination of the first three arguments of the pluralists. And so the pluralists propose their argument mostly through an observation of the behavior of interest groups within our political landscape, recognizing, as even James Madison recognizes, that interest groups or factions or pressure groups or lobbyists do exist within our society, and that the cost of actually getting rid of interest groups, eliminating the ability of people to organize, to form interests, and to pressure our government is antithetical to an actual indirect democracy, and maybe the prospect of actually eliminating groups of people from getting together to try to influence their government's behavior might necessarily be more harmful to our democracy than the bad that they could possibly do. And so the pluralists, playing off of some of the arguments within even Madison's Federalist 10, which has historically been used to validate the attack on interest groups, has really created a space for understanding the behavior of interest groups within our democracy. All right, so this wraps up part one of the discussion on interest groups in American politics. And in part two, we will talk about how interest groups are formed and the conditions in which interest groups really flourish and grow. We'll talk about not only how they grow and what really feeds into the growth of interest groups, but the different types of interest groups that exist within our society, and maybe look at the way in which those types have created an unequal environment whereby interests are not equally represented because of a combination of factors within our society. And the inequality of representation translates to an inequality in the types of policies that are produced to be consistent with that lobbying effort. And then finally, in part two, we'll talk about the different efforts throughout the 20th century and now 21st century to make it harder for the negative aspects of interest groups to be realized, and for really the positive aspects of the capacity of people to try to influence their government and their officials can be more realized. Thank you.